All right, everyone, it's 12 o'clock on the dot, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Camilla Dos Santos. I'm the program coordinator of the Healthy Relationships Initiative, and we are a Guilford County, North Carolina-based initiative. Our mission is to strengthen relationships of all kinds and promote happy, healthy, and safe relationships. We are a partnership between the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and the Phillips Foundation. And I encourage you to visit our website, www.guilfordhri.org, as well as our social media at GuilfordHRI to connect with us and just learn different relationship tips, especially during a challenging time like this. So we'll go ahead and get started. Today's topic is parenting young children during the coronavirus pandemic. I'm really glad that you're here with me today. I figured I would get started by telling you a little bit about myself and my background. You'll see in my video, I will not have any kids running in and out. That's because I don't have any children, but I am a licensed school counselor in the state of North Carolina, and most of my experience is in working with elementary age students, although I do have experience with middle school and high school as well. So today's webinar is intended to just be give you some practical strategies and tips, and in general, just some perspectives to help you get through this time. Feel free to ask me any questions in the chat room. I will be checking it every now and then, and I'll be answering any questions that come up. And while I'm talking and kind of giving you some strategies, feel free to tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're logging in from today, how many children you have, and in general, how the quarantine has worked for you, and if you have any tips or strategies that have worked in your home. But let's go ahead and really get started here. So today we're going to do a couple of things. I wanted to give you a brief overview. We will talk about a couple of different topics. First, we'll talk about how to be a proactive parent in an uncertain time. Many of you probably are very proactive parents, given that you're on this program with me today. But during a challenging time, being proactive just looks a little bit different. And so we'll talk about how you can sort of adjust your parenting to continue to stay proactive, but in a time of more chaos where we need to be a little bit more flexible with what that looks like. We'll also talk about managing misbehavior. I know that kids misbehave anyway, but when they're stuck at home with limited opportunities for activity, I'm sure you're seeing a lot more misbehavior, and we'll talk about some different ways you can manage that in your home. We're going to talk about some ways to really maximize this time for connection. Many of us are spending a lot more time at home with our loved ones and our children, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that time is being intentionally used to connect. And so we'll talk about ways you can connect with your children during this time and some of the benefits associated with doing that. And then we'll end today's webinar with just some general tips for parents, some perspectives to keep you sane during this crazy time, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So let's go ahead and get started. And if you see me kind of looking off to the right here, it's because I do have my notes on a different screen. But we know that the coronavirus pandemic has completely changed the way that we live life. And as a result, it's changed the way that you parent, I'm sure. And as if parenting isn't hard enough, now you're having to learn how to do it in the midst of a pandemic. So first, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but giving yourself grace during this time is going to be your most powerful tool, because being a parent is hard. And so being a parent in a time where we don't know what to expect the next day can feel impossible. So let's talk about some different things that you might have done to stay proactive in your parenting before the pandemic. Maybe before the pandemic, you were that parent who's always maintaining communication with either your providers or your teachers to make sure that everything that's happening outside of your home can be continued in the home as well. Maybe before the pandemic, you were talking openly with your child and responding to negative emotions or behavior right there on the spot, right? Proactive parents tend to address issues when they happen. Maybe before the pandemic, you had a village right? Maybe you enlisted the help of your village for logistical support, whether that means folks picking up your kids from practice, or maybe you enlisted the help of your village for emotional support, or just childcare support, right? Many of us might have our parents involved in the rearing of our children, might have nannies and babysitters, and all of these people in your village you essentially lost with the coronavirus pandemic. Of course, they're still there, and they can still, we'll talk about some different ways that you can connect with them, but the ways in which you were relying on your support systems have undoubtedly changed in the face of all of this. So it's important to note that in a pandemic, being a proactive parent just looks different. So that sort of leads me to my first point in how to remain proactive in a time when it seems like the world's going a little bit crazy. And so the first tip I have for you is to continue to seek out resources and support. So for those of you that are joining me live today, go ahead and give yourself a pat on the back because you've done that, right? You found a resource, you signed up for it, and you're here and you're listening to some information to help support you. That's going to be one of the most beneficial things you can do to continue to stay proactive during these times. The reality is, no one really knows what they're doing, and even those who are experts in relationships and children are having to rethink some of the ways that they would educate others on doing so, because we're in the midst of a crazy time. And so seeking out those resources and being aware of what's out there is going to help you stay intentional and proactive in your parenting. Another way to really remain a proactive parent during this time is to take that village that you were relying on before the pandemic and redefine it. So what do I mean by that? For example, if you had your parents be very involved in your day-to-day with your child, say your child's grandparents provided childcare 2 or 3 times a week. We know that in times of social distancing, they're probably not doing that as often or at all, hopefully, right? Because we're wanting to really maintain those guidelines to stay safe. But just because you don't have access to them in the way that you typically would doesn't mean that you can't really redefine what that help looks like. So for kids who miss their grandparents, FaceTiming and video chatting are going to be a really great way to stay connected and keep those emotional ties strong during this time. We don't want our kids to feel like they've lost their village in the midst of all this. So making time to connect with friends, for those parents who always schedule play dates, Zoom play dates are really hot right now, and parents are using that to stay connected. So finding new ways to redefine what tapping into your village looks like is going to be crucial during a time like this. And then, of course, we want to reinvent our village, right? Because the reality is a lot of the resources that you might have used before the coronavirus pandemic, you probably are not able to use them in the same fashion now. So finding new ways to reinvent your village, and what that can look like can be joining different Facebook groups that help just support parenting, signing up for e-newsletters so you're getting regular information in your inbox and just new ideas about how folks are parenting during this time. Following accounts on social media to kind of learn what people are doing. I will talk more about that because I want parents to tread carefully on comparing what other parents are doing. But as long as you're really looking at what other parents are doing from a healthy perspective and thinking about whether it can fit into your home and how you can change what they're doing to work for your family, I think that's okay to really pull on what other parents are doing that's working. We don't want to reinvent the wheel in a time like this. We're stressed enough. Many of us are having to work from home and parent from home, and so get resources from people who show that that it's working for them. So reinventing your village is one way to keep you sane in the midst of all of this. Finally, I'm a big planner. And so I believe that in all times, but especially in uncertain times, developing a flexible plan is really important. Flexible being the key word. right? So when we talk about a plan, if you're a parent who before all of this really relied on your to-do lists, I encourage you to keep completing those to-do lists. Keep having a plan for what each day will look like. But keep in mind that you might need to be flexible with how the day unfolds. So for example, maybe your to-do list for that day is that you're going to read a short story with your child, and then they're going to complete an arts and crafts activity while you finish a work project. Sounds like a really great plan. But say you wake up that morning and your child wants no part of story time, and instead they want to spend some time on their iPad or on the screen. One of the most important things you can do there during this time is remain flexible throughout all of this. So maybe you really wanted to read a story to start the day. Maybe you really had a plan for what that would look like. But being flexible and adapting is going to be important here. So maybe on that day, when your child really wants to get on the iPad, maybe you say something like, okay, I really wanted to start today with reading a story so we can make sure that you get your story and your reading time in. But because I know that we're all just dealing with a lot of different emotions and mom wants to show she's flexible, so you can be on your screen for 30 minutes, and then when you're done, we're going to read this story together and talk a little bit more about it. So what's important is to really know when to dig in your heels with your plan and when to be a little bit flexible and just kind of compromise with what works best. Finally, that kind of leads me into my next point, right? Picking your parenting battles wisely. I think that if any parent has figured out the science behind this, the magic formula between when to give in and when to dig your heels in, let me know. We can get rich together. We'll write a book. But in general, during the pandemic, you're really going to want to think about compromise here, right? So I mentioned the example earlier about starting the day with a story versus starting the day with screen time. You really want to think about this in terms of what is going to minimize your stress in the moment, but also minimize long-term consequences or any kind of long-term behaviors that might come from it. So I've developed a couple of questions that you can kind of think through in your head when you're in that moment and you're like, okay, do I reinforce what I want to reinforce here, or do I give a little leeway with what I'd like to see? So the first question when you're really thinking about, is this a battle I'm going to get into right now with my child? The first question I encourage you to ask yourself is, what's realistically going to happen if I give in right now? As parents, we can get really creative in our imagination about how we will ruin our children if we don't teach that lesson right in the moment. But when we think about it more rationally, most of the time when we're in a situation that we've got to pick whether or not we're going to really hammer this point home, the odds are you've already talked about a lot of what's going on in that situation with your child. So for example, parents have been teaching right and wrong since long before the pandemic. You've been instilling moderation and balance and all of your family values within your home way before this pandemic even started. So allowing some flexibility and compromising now isn't going to undo everything you've done. You're not going to ruin your child by allowing them to have a little bit more screen time or allowing them to deviate from the plan. And so you really just want to think about what am I looking for here? So that leads me to my second question. What am I trying to teach my child, or what value am I trying to instill? And will this message be received right now anyway? Right? We know that children who are emotionally frustrated or stressed out are not always prepared to receive the lessons that we're teaching anyway. So if you let that one go in the moment, are you really giving up on this huge lesson, or are you possibly just mitigating a situation for right now that could potentially turn into a huge tantrum, for example? So when you think about picking your parenting battles, you want to really think about question number one: what's going to happen if I give in realistically? Right? Is the world going to end, or are we really going to be okay if we get over this one? And then the second question is the lesson that I'm trying to really teach right now going to be received by my child if I dig my heels in? And hopefully, as you sift through these answers, you can make the decision to continue to move forward with your plan of teaching that moment, right? Taking advantage of that teaching moment, or to letting it slide and letting and kind of picking your parenting battles. I do think it's important to note we don't want to let every battle go. We do want to have some accountability and some discipline and structure in our home, and we'll talk more about that in the misbehavior piece. But in general, I would say during a time like this, you're probably going to find yourself letting go of a lot more battles versus digging in your heels. So let's move on to talking about managing misbehavior. I know that many of you are probably dealing with it at home, and I do want to start by just saying this. All children misbehave, and they misbehave in the face of a pandemic or not. And misbehavior by our children is not a reflection of your parenting. But what is a reflection of your parenting is how you respond to that misbehavior, how you deal with it in the moment, and then how you deal with it moving forward. So if you are stuck at home with young children who are driving you crazy or who are misbehaving left and right, take a moment to know that this is not a reflection of you or your home or your parenting. This is a reflection of the times that we're in. Our children have been uprooted from their routines. Whether your child is going to daycare or to school, their life looks completely different now. And how do children respond when they don't always have the words to communicate what they're feeling? They misbehave. So if you're seeing a lot more of that in your home, know that you're probably not the only one. All the memes on social media should give you some guidance as to what parents are dealing with, which is when kids are home for long hours at a time, they find ways to act up, don't they? So when our children are misbehaving, the very first tip I have for you is redirect, redirect, redirect. As parents, you are probably experts in redirecting. Classroom teachers tend to learn it pretty quickly. When I was an elementary school counselor, I became sort of like a Broadway actress. I could really change, get kids to think about something different when they're wanting to misbehave in that moment. And I would suspect that most of you parents are experts in that too. So when we're thinking about, our children misbehaving, you're going to want to redirect as quickly as you see the signs that the misbehavior is going to happen. So you're an expert on your child, right? Odds are when they're showing the early signs of misbehavior or frustration. Maybe they sigh very loud. Maybe they might toss some things off the table. Maybe they cry to express their frustration. If in the moment when you see that first sign, you can redirect them and ask them to do something for you, whether it means you need an additional hand in the kitchen while you're making some PB&Js, or maybe you set up a little arts and crafts area for them and you ask them to make you a drawing. But as much as you can distract them from what is causing that misbehavior in the moment, that's going to really be helpful to you in your home. The reality is we're very limited in the activities that our kids are doing. So our kids are getting bored, right? They're getting tired. So one of the ways that you can really just stay on top of that misbehavior is to have like 3 or 4 redirection activities in your back pocket. So when you start to see those behaviors, you don't even have to make something up. You've got something in mind. Some examples of things I've used in the past have been having a child draw a picture to someone that they love, or helping out with the task. One important thing to note when you're asking a child to help out with a task is make sure it's something that they can either do on their own or with little supervision. We don't want that task to cause further frustration and then possibly exacerbate those behaviors. So think about some different things in your home that you can redirect your child to. Maybe have some tasks ready to go that you can kind of shift them towards when you start to see some of those signs of frustration. When they do misbehave, it's important to use those consequences consistently and clearly. Many of you probably already have consequences in place for certain behaviors, whether it's a certain amount of minutes of timeout, or whether it's apologizing and doing some sort of reparation. When we're using consequences, the two most important words are consistency and clarity. So you're going to want to be consistent in your consequences. If one child misbehaves by not following a directive and another one of your children does the same thing, those consequences should be consistent. Of course, you're going to want to adjust for developmental ages. So for example, a 20-minute timeout for a 5-year-old is not appropriate. But conversely, a 2-minute timeout for a 10-year-old might not be enough time. So think about those consequences, use them consistently, and use them clearly. What I mean when I say clearly, make sure your child understands why they're getting that consequence. So you can say something like, I need you to sit out for 5 minutes with no technology and just sit there and think about why you cannot break those items in the kitchen, or think about why you need to listen to me when I ask you to do something the first time. Making sure your child understands why they get that consequence is going to be one of the most powerful tools that you can use to prevent that behavior from happening in the future. And what's also really important for parents is sometimes as parents, we just take it personal when our kids misbehave, right? We see it as a reflection of what we're doing. But I mentioned earlier that kids misbehave no matter what, and they've misbehaved before the pandemic, and they will after, right? So as parents, we've got to be ready to let it go. Once your child has served that consequence and you've had that opportunity to take advantage of that teaching moment, let it go and allow for a moment to introduce something fun. So say your child threw a tantrum because they didn't feel like cleaning up their room this morning, but then you issued a consequence of a 5-minute timeout and then they had to clean their room. Well, once the room is clean and the 5-minute timeout is done, there's no reason to continue to hammer that home, especially when we're stuck at home, right? We don't want these smaller problems to turn into big parenting issues. So once they've served the consequence, they've cleaned their room, you're happy with the resolution, allow for a moment to do something fun. Play a game, dance to a music video together, draw a picture, but you're going to want to introduce moments to reconnect after a consequence because these moments are not being naturally introduced by outside activities. So let it go once they've done their piece. Finally, as parents, I think this is something you are always dealing with, but managing your own emotions is going to be one of, if not the most powerful tool that you can use during this time. So a stressed out parent has a stressed out child, right? So managing your own emotions, being in tune with whether or not you are able to handle situations with emotional clarity is going to be the best way to manage misbehavior. So if you find that you're unable to really calm down sufficiently to address a situation, you can always come back to the consequence. You can let your child know, Mommy is really stressed out right now, and I'm not sure that I can really talk through this with you in a way that will help us both move forward. So give Mommy 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk about how we can fix this together. And then another way to really manage your own emotions is to rely on your co-parent or your spouse during this time. Those of you who are not living with your child's parent could have some challenges with that. But in general, relying on the other parent to help support you when you're a little emotionally stressed, right? So making sure that your spouse or your co-parent is aware of those consequences and what you're putting in place so that they can help you and jump in if they need to, if you're maybe too emotionally stressed to handle it in that moment. So just be honest with yourself. If you need to take a breath before reacting, do it. If you need to take a few breaths, do it, and invite your child to do it with you. There's a lot to be said for parents who are honest with their child about their emotions. Those children tend to be more aware and in tune of their own emotions as well. So these are some tips for managing misbehavior. If anything comes up, I am checking the chat room, so feel free to ask any questions. But let's move on right along and talk about some different ways to maximize this time to allow for connection and bonding with your child. We spent some time talking about how to stay proactive in your parenting, how to manage misbehavior, but I do want to shift towards maximizing opportunities for connection because you might find that when you focus on creating moments for connection, You can also reduce misbehavior for your children because their emotional needs are being met and they feel like they are connected to you and that they can trust you during times of chaos. So spending quality time with your child is going to be a very valuable tool for misbehavior. In general, when you're thinking about ways to connect with your kids, I like to think of two words. The first word is fun, and the second word is affection. If you try to think about that for your moments or the different ways that you're going to introduce connection in your home, you're more likely to be successful, right? So let's talk about fun. I am seeing so many parents doing really cool things with their kids, whether it's, learning their dance choreography that their kids were learning in their own classes before when we could actually go out in the real world, right? Doing jigsaw puzzles together, doing group workouts, reading together, playing games online, going outside in the garden. And so all of these different opportunities for connection allow you to have fun with your child. Fun is one of the best ways that you can bond in any relationship. So whether it's your your spouse relationship or your relationship with your child, making time for fun leads to both emotional and behavioral benefits in that relationship. And then finally, affection is going to be a really great way to stay connected to your children. And I know that the older your children get, the harder it can be to sometimes show that affection or receive it, especially if you've got preteens or anything like that. But children who really feel physically connected to their parents tend to also be more emotionally balanced as well. So let's talk about some different ways to kind of get creative with that affection, whether it's, rubbing their head every night before they go to bed, singing a song, touching their hands, letting them sit in your lap when you're working on, sending work emails. All of these different ways to physically connect are really going to help your child cope with what's going on and cope with some of the changes that they might not understand. So just spending 15 to 20 minutes each day intentionally connecting with your child, putting away your devices, unless you're using those devices to connect, is going to be a great way to just keep you both kind of in touch with what matters here, which is during times of crisis, we need to lean on each other. And there's a lot of emotional benefits to showing affection and having fun with one another. So hopefully you'll make some time each day, 15 to 20 minutes to do just that. So we're about halfway through, and I do want to get into just in general some tips for parenting in the face of COVID-19. And these are things that I've just kind of thought about from things that I want all parents to know during this time. And the first one is to really give yourself grace. Parents are always their own worst critics. And you really have a way of just demanding perfection from yourselves, right? But the reality is that there's no handbook for parenting, and there's certainly no handbook for parenting in the face of a pandemic. So give yourself grace. Know that this is an unprecedented time, and that these times call for extra patience, both with ourselves and with others. We often think of grace as something we extend towards someone else, right? If someone's going through a hard time, we tell ourselves, they just need a little bit more time to work through that. Or I'm not going to really bring this up right now because they really need some space. Or I can't expect that person to do this perfectly with what they're going through. But how often do we do that for ourselves, right? How often do we give ourselves some grace during really hard times? So I encourage you to be as kind to yourself as you are to others during this time, and to not forget that in the midst of all of this. So one way that you can give yourself grace is by this idea of a mantra, something that you tell yourself every day to remind yourself that you're doing the best that you can. So I'll share something that I used to tell myself. I came up with a mantra about 7 or 8 years ago when I was going through my graduate program, because I needed to remember that there was going to be an end game to graduate school. So I always would tell myself in times of stress, Camilla, you got this. you got this. That was just something that worked for me. That mantra might not work for other people. But I've noticed that in the face of this pandemic, I've had to change my own personal mantra. Camilla, you got this just doesn't work for me right now because I don't feel like I always got this, right? So I've changed my mantra, and now I tell myself just about every day when I wake up in the morning and often before I go to bed, I'm doing the best I can with what I have, and no one knows what they're doing. So that's what I tell myself. That's what makes me feel better. So today, when you sign off to this webinar, or if you're taking some notes right now, I encourage you to write down a parenting mantra for yourself. So some examples, that you might have, or I encourage you to share some examples in the chat room. But maybe your parenting mantra is, I love my children, and each day I'll show them that, and that's what matters, right? Or I'm being the best parent that I know how to be. Giving yourself some daily encouragement is really going to help you get through this time. And then, on that same note of giving yourself grace, you have to take care of yourself during a time like this. I mean, in general, we want to take care of ourselves anytime. But during a time when you're expected to really parent young children, when we don't even know how to kind of navigate this world, your emotional and self-care is going to be really important here. I mentioned earlier, and this is something I used to say all of the time when I was working in the schools, stressed out parents have stressed out children. And so as much as you are managing your own stress, taking time for daily self-care, taking time to give yourself what you need physically and emotionally, as much as you're doing that, for yourself, you're helping your parenting skills as well. So a lot of times parents feel selfish when they focus on their self-care, but I encourage you to really revamp that perspective and tell yourself, if I don't focus on my self-care, I can't be a good parent. Right? In counseling, we learn early on, you can't be good to anybody else if you're not good for yourself. And I would say that really applies in parenting too. So my next tip here for you is be flexible. You've probably heard me say that a few times throughout this program, but it can't be said enough. We're really living in a crazy time that demands flexibility. So in general, be flexible about your ideas, about your perspectives for how your day will go. Set realistic expectations, right, for what you're hoping that your day will look like. But one thing I really want to say, because I know parents are struggling with this, is it's okay to be flexible with screen time right now. In fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics recently put out an article that basically recognizes kids will have more access to screen time during the pandemic. That doesn't mean that it's that kids are going to leave this pandemic with no social skills or no ability to deal with face-to-face interactions. What it means is that you're having to use your resources in an already limited, our resources are already limited. And so parents, it's okay to be flexible with screen time. If you're that family who really moderates your child's screen time and puts limits on it, I encourage you to maintain some limits and to maintain some moderation, but in general, accept and know that it's okay that your kids are going to spend more time on the screen. And that's not a reflection of your parenting, that's a reflection of the crazy times we're living in. And I sort of mentioned this earlier, but setting realistic expectations, and especially as it pertains to social media and some of the parenting blogs. I mentioned earlier, using those resources, using what parents are doing via social media and blogging is a great tool. But you really want to be careful with sort of comparing yourself to other parents. We know that's an issue in society today. We do it without even knowing that we do it. But remember this, what works for a family somewhere in Texas or somewhere in Washington might not work for you, right? There are so many family dynamics that come into play when you actually see a parent doing something that works, right? So it's important to keep in mind that you're going to want to set realistic expectations for your home. So if before this pandemic, you were not the parent who posts visual schedules all over your house and who had behavior reward charts all over the fridge, if you weren't that parent beforehand, now is probably not the time to introduce tons of schedules and behavior charts in your family, right? You might want to start small. Do one behavior chart on the refrigerator, if any at all. But in general, you don't have to become this superhero parent with all of these charts and visuals all over your house if that's not how you were parenting before. So take some notes from what you were doing before and try to redefine that in your own home, keeping in mind that there is no right way to do this right now. We're all figuring it out. And so when we talk about realistic expectations, some days it is more than, it is a successful day if your kids ate, uh, went to bed on time, right? That's just the world we're living in. Sometimes those are accomplishments for the day that you can hang your hat on. But other days you might be able to finish that jigsaw puzzle, or you might be able to do that garden activity outside. And so just being realistic about that and not expecting every day to go as you have planned, right? Knowing that things can change every day and we've got to adapt as we go. So make sure you're setting realistic expectations for yourself and for your parenting. Also keeping in mind that trust yourself during this time, right? Long before this pandemic, you have been teaching your children values. You have been teaching them about right and wrong well before coronavirus. And so everything you were instilling beforehand is still there. Trust in your parenting. Know that your flexibility now isn't going to ruin your children later, right? Trust that you are the expert on your child and that you know what's best for your home. And trust your gut with those decisions too. So if you wake up tomorrow and you know what, the whole family just wants to spend the day outside in the yard, do it. Toss everything to the side if you can and spend that time outside. But in general, trust that during times of crisis, you know what's best for your family and you know that your parenting is going to hold true either during or after a pandemic. And then finally, try to find the silver lining, right? When I was a school counselor, I would so often hear, and even in my work through HRI, when I used to do a lot of, hopefully I'll do them again, but a lot of face-to-face relationship education and parenting programs. And I always would hear parents talk about the lack of time or the lack of ability to get everybody in the same house to do something together, right? So how many times have you wished to be more present with your child? How many times do you wish you could have played that game or read that story or been there for bedtime, right? These are not ideal circumstances, and I don't want to make it seem like we're all at home, not working, and just having all this extra time, because in fact, many of you might be also struggling to fit in your working responsibilities while being at home. But in general, trying to find the silver lining in all of this. When's the last time that you had everybody in the house at the same time, right? When's the last time that there were no other distractions in the outside world because there is nothing to do? So spend time with each other. Get creative about what that time looks like. Do all of those things that you wish you could have done as a family before, but that you didn't have time for, maybe. So I encourage you to maybe find the silver lining as much as possible. It's not easy, but I think each day, if you can find one thing that you're grateful for or one thing that went right, that's going to help you keep a level head throughout all of this parenting in the midst of all of this. So right now, that leaves us at about the end of our content here. If anybody has any questions for me, please feel free to ask them in the chat room. I do not see any questions right now, so I'll go ahead and just move on. And thank you for joining me today. This was my first webinar, so if you've got any feedback for me, I'd love to hear it. I will follow up this webinar with an email with some resources for parents, both Healthy Relationship Initiative resources, as well as outside organizations that you might find useful during this time. And I do have another webinar coming up next Monday on staying connected while social distancing. So I encourage you to join me through there. You can connect through our website and get the registration information there. I do see some questions, so let's see if I can Oh, all right. Just thank you. It seems like you have enjoyed it, and I've got some positive feedback. So I really appreciate that. Connect with the Healthy Relationships Initiative. We've been around for quite some time, but we're really working hard to get new resources online for parents and also for relationships of all kinds. So that link on the bottom left, www.guilfordhri.org, has tons of online resources to help you kind of work through these challenging times. And I'm excited to have been here with you today. I'm just going to take one more quick look at the chat to make sure I don't have any other questions. Okay, I do see some questions. How do you not feel guilty about screen time usage? Great question. And that's something that's really hard to deal with because it seems like all of the messages that we get are to moderate that screen time. And, you know, we hear so many messages about kids don't know how to communicate. Kids only do stuff online. But I'll give you some sort of background to help you overcome this guilt. Number one, actually, there's a lot of research that indicates that while youth these days do spend a lot of time online and connecting through devices, they are not communicating any less, actually. They just communicate a lot differently. So when I think about, you know, screen time in kids, what I would say is this. Right now, every child in the world is probably spending a lot more time online. So think about what balance looks like for you. I've spoken with some parents who have said that for 1 hour each day, no one on the family is connected to any device at all, and they use that time very intentionally. But some other ways to really not feel guilty about allowing screen time usage is to make sure that that time is used productively for children. So there's a lot of academic videos and academic games that they can play so that you don't feel like they're rotting their brains while they're online. But in general, I mentioned earlier, I'll say it again, the Academy of the Association of Pediatrics has basically said kids are going to spend more time on screens, and that's okay. That's okay. That's, you know, the experts are saying it, so we can feel good about it. I see some folks asking about a recording of this webinar. It will be available through our guilfordhri.org website. So as soon as that recording is available, we will post it on our website and on our Facebook. So connect with us if you haven't yet. And I'll also share the replay link via email once it's available as well. So I'll make a note to do that. I see that some folks have used this as an assignment for school. So I'm glad you were able to be productive and get your academics in today. But thank you again, everyone, for being here. Again, next Monday, tune in for ways to stay connected during social distancing. I will follow up with some resources via email. And remember, there is no such thing as a perfect parent. So just be a real one and do the best you can. You will find that you're probably doing a much better job than you're giving yourself credit for. So thank you for being here with me today. Take care, everyone. Love up your children. And remember to spend some time on self-care too. Take care.